This talk reviews the use of historical descriptions for studying the past spatial and temporal dimensions of indigenous cultural burning in the eastern and central U.S. Researchers studying the past patterns of fire and its effects on forested ecosystems in the eastern U.S. prior to Euro-American settlement have used varied forms of data and evidence, such as tree ring fire scar records, land survey records, and historical descriptions. Each type of data has strengths and weaknesses. For example, tree ring fire scar records provide physical evidence of fire. Scars from non-lethal fires are formed when heat kills cambial cells on trunks that heal over subsequent years of annual growth. Using dendrochronological methods, the frequency and seasonality of fire can be determined. While they provide direct evidence of fire, studies developing these records require trees that predate Euro-American settlement. Also, records are currently not uniformly distributed and are often located far from former indigenous settlements. Land survey records of the circa 17th to 19th centuries are another source. Surveyors observed timber species and forest structure along survey lines, and marked witness trees as survey markers, which together provide a way to estimate the past distribution and abundance of tree species and ecosystem types. This map, for instance, shows surveyor observations of open oak ecosystems circa 1795 in western New York, symbolized in red. I will show this map later when comparing model predictions to historical descriptions from other documents. Survey records are invaluable for mapping and understanding past fire-dependent ecosystems, yet they too have limitations such as ambiguity, error, and bias. Finally, historical descriptions are early first-hand accounts and other descriptions of indigenous cultural burning and burned landscapes, such as those made by Euro-American pioneers, travelers, and historians. This presentation reviews the use of these 17th to 19th century historical descriptions in order to infer past fire patterns in the eastern U.S. and Great Plains. This talk has 4 parts. First, I list types and provide examples of historical descriptions. Then I share scholarly sources with lists, datasets, and/or extensive synthesis of historical descriptions. Next, I cover how researchers have interpreted and analyzed descriptions directly, as well as used historical descriptions as a means of corroborating other data and methods. And finally, I briefly discuss limitations and caveats of historical descriptions. I will often draw upon my research in Western New York. Before continuing, I acknowledge the positionality of this research. I am a researcher trained in Western modes of scholarship, and a big omission from this research and the historical record is traditional ecological knowledge from Eastern indigenous peoples. Accounts in this presentation are from Euro-American settlers, colonists, and pioneers who were often the first to claim dispossessed indigenous lands. Moreover, the accounts sometimes contain racist language in describing indigenous peoples. First, I offer a typology of historical descriptions and some examples. In my 2024 publication from International Journal of Wildland Fire, I classified historical descriptions of indigenous cultural burning into 6 classes. These categories were based on descriptions discovered within varied historical texts and documents, such as traveler, colonist, or missionary journals, and early county or town histories. Listed here are various types, and on the following slides are examples of each type. The first 3 types are first-hand accounts. First-hand observations of a specific event are descriptions of single burns, such as for hunting or sometimes wartime use to repel enemies. These most often are found in earlier colonist or settler texts of the 17th to 19th centuries. As one example, John Mackay described a ring hunt here using fire in the Geneseo Groveland area of western New York in 1795, in which indigenous peoples burned 7 square miles. The Seneca Iroquois in the area signed the Treaty of Big Tree just 2 years later to cede their lands here. These types of accounts are rare. Another type are general first-hand observations of burning. These are descriptions by early Europeans or Euro-Americans who purportedly had close knowledge of indigenous burning, but describe only its general use rather than a single event. They often describe fire for hunting or for general forest thinning to aid travel. These are also most often found in texts of the 17th to 19th centuries. Examples include Adrian van der Donk's account from mid-17th century Mohawk or Mohican territory in present-day eastern New York, which described, quote, bush burning and its many benefits, including to, quote, thin out the forest and as a hunting tool. He also describes having seen fire while sailing along the Hudson or Mohawk River. These accounts are also rare. Other early writers observed cleared landscapes firsthand and speculated that fire was the cause. They sometimes also describe observing charcoal or secondary succession, such as vigorous sapling growth, providing evidence of fire exclusion. This type is often found in early traveler or pioneer journals. In 1816, for example, David Thomas traveled into western New York, past the Canawagas Indian Reservation, and into an oak plain with, quote, stunted white oaks, which probably in former times had been annually ravaged by fires. Historical summaries with first-hand observations cited extrapolate past observations of indigenous cultural burning or cleared landscapes within a general region to a related or more specific geographic area. These summaries appear in early county or town histories of the 19th and 20th centuries in regions with former indigenous settlement. In an 1841 text, for example, writers Barber and Howe state that the town of Pembroke, New York, once contained oak openings, and they quote a lengthy passage from Dr. Timothy Dwight, who traveled through the area decades before. Other historical summaries offer general historical descriptions of indigenous cultural burning and its effects on structure and composition of forests, without citing or referring to first-hand accounts. The reliability of the writer is uncertain. These appear often within early county or town histories of the 19th century. Here, Stafford Cleveland, writing in 1873, describes ridges of Yates County, New York, that were repeatedly burned by indigenous peoples for creating open spaces for deer and elk. Finally, historical documents occasionally explain the origin or translation of place names with some connection to fire or open oak ecosystems. In this example, an explanation of Burnt Hills Village in eastern New York is given. It was named for a, quote, part of the country which the Indians had been accustomed to burn over periodically for the purpose of forming a deer pasture. There are some works by indigenous scholars who interpret indigenous place names that relate to fire as well. After defining types of historical descriptions, I would now like to summarize some scholarly works that compiled and/or rigorously applied descriptions to understand indigenous cultural burning. Listed here are 8 works covering the eastern U.S. and/or Great Plains, selected for this slide because they list, map, and/or cite numerous historical descriptions of indigenous cultural burning, often hundreds. Some especially notable efforts are as follows. Omer Stewart's Forgotten Fires was a manuscript completed in 1954 but not published until 2002. It contains several hundred pages of qualitative interpretation of sources across the continent, including many historical descriptions of the types talked about in this presentation, representing an early monumental synthesis. There have been at least 2 papers on the plains and prairies, Higgins' compilation for the northern Great Plains, and McLean and others' paper on the Midwestern tallgrass prairie. Gerald Williams, the national historian for the USDA Forest Service, compiled an annotated bibliography of 120 pages, with many entries for early historical texts from the eastern U.S. Skurian and others compiled information from ethnographers who observed indigenous cultures directly to study off-site fire use globally, including for the eastern U.S. Finally, my 2024 publication compiled descriptions for the northeastern and midwestern U.S. I applied a method to download thousands of text format historical documents from the Internet Archive, break those texts up by paragraph, count the number of keywords per paragraph, like Indian or burn or fire, then use keyword counts per paragraph as independent variables. I then developed a machine learning model to discover historical accounts of cultural burning from the digitized texts. This information retrieval work was performed using R programming language. 5 of these sources created a table or structured data set of historical accounts: the Higgins, Whitney, Skurian and others, McLean and others, and Tulowiecki works. Shown here is the database from the Skurian paper containing data on descriptions, such as indigenous tribe, general location, vegetation burned, source of the description, a quotation, and many other attributes. And 2 sources provide extensive lists of sources alongside excerpts from them, specifically the Higgins and Williams sources. Shown here are sources and excerpts from mid-19th century accounts compiled in the Higgins paper for the Northern Great Plains. Historical accounts have been interpreted and analyzed directly, as well as compared with findings from other methodologies, for many aims. This part describes some of those aims and findings, often citing sources previously mentioned. First, overall, some studies using historical descriptions have quantified the relative frequency of human versus natural ignitions, determining that anthropogenic causes were more common. For example, from the Midwestern tallgrass prairie, McLean and others found evidence of only 5 lightning-caused fires, versus 32 that were attributed to indigenous peoples. The other causes were Euro-Americans or undetermined. These results communicate the predominance of human over natural ignitions in some regions of the continent. Other studies have inferred the purpose of cultural burning from historical descriptions. The Skurian and others paper produced this bar graph, which shows the number of cases of off-site fire use described in ethnographic works, broken down by vegetation structure, the columns, and purpose of burning, the rows. It found, for instance, that within temperate deciduous forests, fire was used most often to drive game and to clear land. Note that this table is from a global study that includes ethnographic descriptions from the eastern US. As another example, here's a table from McLean and others that lists wildfires attributed to Native Americans from 1673 to 1836. Similar to the previous slide, but focusing on the Midwestern tallgrass prairie, this study found that indigenous fire use was most used for hunting, but also for wartime tactics. Studies have also used historical descriptions to determine the seasonality of cultural burning. Here are 2 bar charts from McLean and others, and Higgins, each showing the seasonality of all wildland fires on the left, and specifically indigenous set fires on the right, both for prairie regions. Time is on the x-axis and number of fire records or events is on the y-axis in both graphs. Both communicate that fire was most common in the fall and second most common in the spring. These accounts are from the prairie biome, but they agree with numerous dendrochronology-based studies of the seasonality of fire from bordering states. This table excerpt from a 2022 paper by Abrams and others compiles fire scar records from oak and pine-dominated forests for Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, West Virginia, and Virginia, and lists the percentage of fire scars occurring during the dormant season versus the growing season. Note the high percentage of dormant season burns across almost all sites. These results both agree with findings based on historical descriptions and also suggest human ignitions during seasons when lightning was less common. A few studies have mapped the approximate locations of historical descriptions to reveal the spatial extensiveness of fire. This map is also from McLean and others, and it shows rough locations of accounts, symbolized with a black X, particularly in Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin. It shows that within the Midwestern tallgrass prairie, accounts from 1673 to 1905 generally occurred along its eastern margin, perhaps because at the time this region was the American frontier and a major zone of indigenous European interaction. Here is a web map from my 2024 publication showing a spatial data layer that maps and symbolizes descriptions as one of 6 types previously described. In another map within the web address listed, I map these descriptions by their positional uncertainty, because often a precise location cannot be determined. This map shows how widespread these historical descriptions were across the Midwestern and Northeastern US. In the same publication, I made a brief comparison between historical descriptions resolvable to the town or county level and an estimate of fire-adapted tree taxa from original land survey records by Pachioric and others in their 2016 paper to see if historical descriptions correspond with fire-adapted trees. Descriptions are differentiated by type using shape and color. Darker shades of gray indicate higher relative abundance of fire-adapted trees, namely oak, hickory, chestnut, and pine. The map shows that descriptions of fire use occur almost exclusively within areas with high percentages of fire-adapted taxa prior to Euro-American settlement. Notice, for instance, that in the northern tension zone region that separates fire-adapted versus fire-sensitive forests, peninsulas of pyrogenic vegetation loosely correspond with historical descriptions along Allegheny, Susquehanna, Hudson, and Connecticut river valleys, where indigenous settlement occurred. There are other examples of using historical descriptions as supporting evidence, including for more rigorous local extent investigations into fire-vegetation relationships. In a 2020 publication, my collaborators and I sought to map the late 18th century distribution of oak savannas, a now rare fire-dependent ecosystem, in western New York, and to assess the relative influence of environmental and anthropogenic controls on its distribution. We used land survey records, GIS format environmental data, predictive geospatial modeling, and content analysis of historical descriptions within a multidisciplinary framework. This region was historically the territory of the Seneca Iroquois, one of the 5 nations in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. To understand how we use descriptions, I first give some background into the modeling part of the study. To locate historical references to oak savannas, we searched land survey records of the 1790s that divided western New York into townships. We sought observations of open oak ecosystems with language like oak openings, oak plains, open oak woods, thinly timbered with oak, or scattering timber with oak. On this survey line, surveyors noted land thinly timbered with black and white oak in two different segments. The presence and absence of these descriptions form the dependent variable for distribution modeling. Using GIS software, we map the surveyor observations. Here's a map of our study area showing Lake Erie to the west, Lake Ontario to the north, and the current-day cities of Buffalo and Rochester. This map now shows the locations of those open oak observations in red, survey lines in black, and indigenous towns of the late 18th century as black points. Using species distribution modeling techniques like maxent and boosted regression trees, we modeled the distribution of oak savannas and related ecosystems using surveyor observations as training data. We tested 31 predictors representing climate, soil, terrain, and distance to Native American settlement. We determined which variables were most predictive of open oak ecosystems and their relationships. Here are graphs from a maxent model of oak savanna distribution in the 1790s. Our models suggested that locations close to indigenous settlement, with drier climate, and with well-drained, less acidic sandy soils were associated with oak savanna presence. This map shows the predictions made by our model. Darker red indicates higher probability of oak savannas circa 1795, and black dots are indigenous towns. Rather than stopping here, we sought historical descriptions of cultural burning to see if fire was correlated with the predicted distribution of oak savannas, as a means of independently validating the model predictions. Here are three descriptions that I previously shared of three locations in western New York, each describing cultural burning and open oak ecosystems. Finally, this map shows model predictions in red, indigenous towns as black dots, and the estimated locations of historical descriptions as black plus signs. Notice the correspondence between high model predictions and the descriptions. Labeled 1 through 3 are the locations of the descriptions on the previous slide. In this manner, we see the value of historical descriptions and how they provide an independent means of validating models of past fire-dependent ecosystems via direct human observations. Overall, historical descriptions show a fair amount of consistency regarding the ubiquity of fire, the seasonality of fire, and the purposes of fire. They also support or are supported by findings from other data or methodologies like dendrochronology, interpretation of land survey records, and geospatial modeling. However, like historical records of various sorts, they have limitations and caveats. Many accounts, especially older ones, have positional ambiguity. It can be challenging to pinpoint a precise location for these descriptions. However, in my 2024 paper, about 85% of descriptions could be resolved to a county, town, or smaller geographic unit. Some accounts may be speculative. People may have incorrectly assumed that cultural burning created an open landscape, for instance. They may also falsely ascribe a burned area to indigenous peoples, which instead may have been due to lightning or Euro-Americans. There could also be forms of geographic bias. To produce a description, you first need a text, and texts, especially local histories, are more common in populated places. Also, places where indigenous and Euro-American settlement overlapped in time may produce more accounts, whereas locations where Euro-American settlement began long after indigenous settlement may produce fewer accounts. Overall, however, I believe these historical descriptions are generally reliable and worthwhile for corroborating other methodologies. I base my beliefs on my own research comparing these descriptions with other forms of historical data and the consistency with which various research teams have reached similar conclusions. Overall, these accounts enliven research with human observations of past burning. They are a valid way to understand the past geographic distribution of fire if used carefully and ideally in conjunction with other methods. They could be one piece of evidence in multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary research involving historians, ecologists, geographers, land managers, and indigenous scholars. There is much qualitative evidence of indigenous burning throughout eastern forests and transitional zones, several hundreds to thousands of first-hand and other early historical descriptions. Still, however, they are no replacement for lost traditional ecological knowledge. Increasing indigenous scholarship in the eastern U.S. is a promising trend with potential to inform and enrich our understanding of cultural burning, alongside these useful but oftentimes imperfect historical descriptions and other methodologies for studying past fire. Finally, I have a request. If you know of any historical descriptions within eastern U.S. forests and the forest-prairie transition, or texts that compile these descriptions, please share them. Visit my web map using this link or QR code, then find the Google form link where you can report descriptions not shown on the map. I hope to expand this map south to Florida and west to the forest grassland ecotone with the help of undergraduate research assistants. My vision is to make this a bigger resource for land managers, fire practitioners, geographers, historians, ecologists, indigenous scholars, and other interested researchers. Or you can also email me at the address shown here. Thank you.